Sometimes the most powerful acts of courage don't happen on battlefields or in royal ceremonies. Sometimes they happen in hospital corridors, where a man trained to protect royalty discovers that the greatest honor comes from protecting the dreams of a 6-year-old girl who refuses to let cancer steal her smile. This is the true story of how one moment of human connection shattered centuries of royal protocol, proving that some rules are meant to be broken when a child's hope hangs in the balance. What began as a chance encounter between duty and innocence would challenge everything a decorated soldier believed about service, sacrifice, and what it truly means to guard something precious. In the sterile halls of London's Great Ormond Street Hospital, where beeping machines mark time like metronomes of survival, an unlikely friendship was about to unfold that would touch the heart of a nation and remind us all that sometimes the smallest battles require the biggest heroes. The morning rain drummed against the windows of Great Ormond Street Hospital as Staff Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial tunic for the third time. At 34, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 12 years, standing motionless outside Buckingham Palace through scorching summers and freezing winters. His posture was perfect, his uniform immaculate, and his dedication unwavering. Today, however, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. The hospital visit was supposed to be routine. A member of the royal family was scheduled to tour the children's cancer ward, and James had been assigned as part of the security detail. He had done similar duties before, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring safety protocols were followed. But as he walked through the hospital corridors that Tuesday morning in March, something felt different. The walls were painted in cheerful yellows and blues, adorned with colorful artwork created by young patients. Unlike the formal grandeur of the palace, this place hummed with a different kind of energy. Nurses moved with purposeful urgency, their shoes squeaking against polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of children's laughter mixing with the steady beep of medical equipment. James had always prided himself on his ability to remain emotionally detached during duty. It was a necessity of the job. Royal guards were expected to be living statues, present but invisible, protective but unobtrusive. Personal feelings had no place in royal protocol. Yet as he passed room after room of young patients, many with bald heads covered by colorful bandanas or whimsical hats, he felt something stirring in his chest that he couldn't quite name. The royal entourage was running late, which was unusual but not unprecedented. James found himself with 30 minutes to wait in the hospital's main corridor. Protocol dictated that he should find a discreet corner and remain still until needed. Instead, he noticed a small commotion near the children's play area. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by scattered puzzle pieces. She wore a bright pink pajama set dotted with unicorns, and a knitted purple hat covered her head. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed too mature for someone so young. Yet her expression was one of determined concentration as she worked on what appeared to be a 1,000-piece puzzle of Buckingham Palace. What caught James's attention wasn't just the subject of the puzzle, but the girl's obvious frustration. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes as she struggled to fit pieces together with hands that shook slightly. A woman, presumably her mother, sat nearby reading a magazine, occasionally glancing up with a worried expression. James knew he should maintain his position. Guards didn't interact with civilians during duty unless absolutely necessary. But something about the scene pulled at him. Perhaps it was the determination in the child's posture, or the way she wiped her nose with the back of her hand and immediately returned to the puzzle, refusing to give up. Against every instinct of his training, James found himself walking over. "That's quite a challenging puzzle," he said softly, crouching down beside her. The little girl looked up, her eyes widening as she took in his red tunic, the golden buttons, and the tall black hat he carried under his arm. For a moment, she seemed speechless. "Are you a Real Guard?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make him disappear. "I am," James replied, setting his bearskin hat carefully on the floor beside him. "My name is James. What's yours?" "Sophie," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Sophie Elizabeth Thompson. My middle name is after the Queen. Mummy says I'm named after someone very important." James smiled, something that rarely happened while in uniform. "That's a beautiful name. And you're quite right about Queen Elizabeth being important. Is that her palace you're working on?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, then her face fell. "I wanted to finish it before my next treatment tomorrow. But it's really hard, and my hands get shaky sometimes because of the medicine." The honesty in her voice hit James like a physical blow. He had faced enemy fire during his military service before joining the Queen's Guard, had stood in formation during terrorist threats, had maintained composure during protests and public disturbances. Yet this 6-year-old's simple statement about her medical treatment affected him more deeply than any of those experiences. "May I help you?" he asked, picking up a corner piece that clearly belonged to one of the palace's towers. Sophie's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? You know about the palace?" "I should hope so," James said with a chuckle. "I work there." For the next 25 minutes, James forgot about protocol, about proper guard behavior, about the invisible barrier that was supposed to exist between his professional duties and personal emotions. He sat on the hospital floor in his pristine red uniform, helping a sick little girl piece together an image of the place where he served. Sophie chattered as they worked, telling him about her favorite unicorn named Sparkles, about how she wanted to be a princess when she grew up, and about how she was fighting the bad cells with the help of the doctors. Her matter-of-fact way of discussing her illness was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Do you really know the Queen?" Sophie asked as they completed the palace's main facade. "I do," James replied. "I help keep her safe." "Is she nice?" James considered the question seriously. In all his years of service, he had never thought about the Queen in terms of nice. She was his sovereign, his duty, his honor to serve. But, looking at Sophie's expectant face, he found himself thinking of her differently. "She's very kind," he said finally. "And I think she would like you very much." Sophie beamed, then grew thoughtful. "Do you think I'll ever get to meet her?" She trailed off, not finishing the sentence. The unfinished question hung in the air like a challenge. James looked at this brave little girl who was fighting for her life, while maintaining enough hope to dream of meeting royalty, and something fundamental shifted inside him. In that moment, sitting on a hospital floor helping with a puzzle, James Mitchell, the Queen's Guard, became something more. He became a man who was about to make a promise he had no idea how to keep. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think dreams are important things to have." A commotion in the corridor indicated the arrival of the royal party. James quickly stood, retrieving his bearskin and adjusting his tunic. Sophie looked up at him with wide eyes. "Will I see you again?" she asked. James hesitated. Protocol dictated that this interaction should end here, that he should return to his duties and never think of this moment again. But, as he looked down at Sophie, still sitting among the puzzle pieces with hope shining in her tired eyes, he knew he couldn't simply walk away. "I hope so," he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. As the royal entourage approached, James took his position, becoming once again the perfectly still, emotionally detached guard he was trained to be. But, inside, everything had changed. He had looked into the eyes of real courage, and it wore a purple knitted hat and unicorn pajamas. Sophie's mother approached him quietly as the royal party passed by. "Thank you," she whispered. She hasn't smiled like that in weeks. James nodded slightly, the only acknowledgement he could give while on duty. But, as he watched Sophie wave at him from her spot on the floor, her face radiant with happiness, he realized that his life as a royal guard had just become infinitely more complicated. Later that evening, as James removed his uniform in the quiet of his small London flat, Sophie's question echoed in his mind. "Do you think I'll ever get to meet her?" The innocent hope in her voice had awakened something in him that 12 years of rigid military discipline couldn't suppress. James had spent his career following orders without question, maintaining the ancient traditions of the Queen's Guard with unwavering dedication. He knew the protocols, the hierarchies, the proper channels for everything from requesting leave to reporting security concerns. But nowhere in his training had anyone prepared him for what to do when duty collided with the dreams of a dying child. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his modest bedroom, James made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was going to find a way to make Sophie's dream come true, even if it meant challenging every rule he had sworn to uphold. The rain continued to fall against his window, but inside James Mitchell's heart, something new was beginning to bloom. It was the dangerous, wonderful realization that sometimes being truly faithful to one's duty meant being willing to break the rules that defined it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching James's mood as he stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace. The familiar weight of his bearskin felt heavier than usual, and the scarlet wool of his tunic seemed to itch against his skin. Every few minutes, his thoughts drifted to Sophie, who was scheduled for treatment that very day. During his lunch break, James did something he had never done before in 12 years of service. He called the hospital. Great Ormond Street Hospital, how may I help you? Came the cheerful voice of a receptionist. James hesitated, suddenly, realizing how absurd his request would sound. I'm inquiring about a patient, Sophie Thompson. I met her yesterday during the royal visit. There was a pause. Are you family, sir? No, James struggled with how to explain his connection to a 6-year-old cancer patient. I'm with the Queen's Guard. I helped her with a puzzle yesterday, and I wanted to know how her treatment went. Another pause, longer this time. I'm afraid I can't give out patient information to non-family members, sir. Hospital policy. James hung up, frustrated but not surprised. Privacy laws existed for good reasons, but they left him with no way to check on Sophie's well-being. He spent the rest of his shift distracted, earning a sharp look from Sergeant Major Williams, his immediate superior. That evening, James made an even more unprecedented decision. Still wearing his civilian clothes, he returned to the hospital as a visitor. He brought with him a small gift, a commemorative pin from the Queen's Guard that bore the royal coat of arms. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible from the world Sophie dreamed of entering. The children's ward felt different in the evening. The lighting was softer, and many of the young patients were having dinner with their families. James approached the nurse's station with the same nervous energy he had felt before his first ceremonial duty. Excuse me, he said to a nurse with kind eyes and graying hair. I'm looking for Sophie Thompson. I met her yesterday, and I wanted to see how she's doing. The nurse, whose name tag read Margaret, studied him carefully. You're the guard who helped her with the puzzle, aren't you? She hasn't stopped talking about you all day. Relief flooded through James. How is she? How did the treatment go? Margaret's expression grew more serious. It's been a difficult day for her. The chemotherapy was particularly hard this time. She's been asking for you, actually. Kept saying she hoped her palace friend would come back. May I see her? Margaret glanced around, then lowered her voice. Officially, visiting hours are over, and you're not family. Unofficially, she smiled. That little girl could use some cheering up. Room 412, but don't stay too long. James found Sophie's room easily enough. Through the partially open door, he could see her lying in bed, looking impossibly small against the white sheets. Her purple hat was gone, revealing a completely bald head that made her appear even more fragile than before. Her mother sat beside the bed, holding her hand. James knocked softly. Sophie's mother looked up, and her face immediately brightened with recognition. You're the guard from yesterday, she said, rising from her chair. I'm Sarah, Sophie's mom. She's been talking about you nonstop. How is she? James asked, stepping into the room. Sleeping now. The treatment was rough today. They always are, but this one. Sarah's voice caught slightly. The doctors are saying the cancer is more aggressive than they initially thought. They're having to increase the intensity of the chemotherapy. James felt his heart sink. He looked at Sophie's peaceful face, noting the pale complexion and the dark circles that seemed deeper than before. Is she? Sarah seemed to understand the unfinished question. They don't give timelines with children this young. Every case is different. But they're being more honest with us about how serious this is. James pulled out the Queen's Guard pin. I brought this for her. I thought she might like it when she wakes up. Sarah took the pin, examining the intricate details of the royal coat of arms. She'll treasure this. You know, she told me yesterday that meeting you was better than any medicine the doctors could give her. The comment hit James like a physical blow. He had spent years protecting people he never really knew, maintaining a professional distance from those he served. Yet in 25 minutes with Sophie, he had felt more purpose than in all his years of ceremonial duty combined. Mrs. Thompson, James said carefully. Sophie mentioned yesterday that she dreams of meeting the Queen. I know it sounds impossible, but is that something she talks about often? Sarah smiled sadly. Constantly. Ever since she was diagnosed, she's been fascinated with the royal family. She says if she can't be a regular princess, maybe she can at least meet a real one. It gives her something to focus on besides the treatments. James nodded, his mind already racing. What if I told you I might be able to arrange something? Not meeting the Queen herself, perhaps, but maybe a private tour of Buckingham Palace or a meeting with some of the other guards. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Could you really do that? The honest answer was no. James had no idea if such a thing was possible. Royal protocol was rigid and complex, with layers of approval required for even minor deviations from standard procedure. Taking a civilian child, especially one who wasn't part of any official program, into the palace would require permissions that James had never attempted to secure. I don't know, he said truthfully. but I'd like to try. At that moment, Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw James standing beside her bed, her face lit up with pure joy. "You came back," she said, her voice weak but filled with excitement. "Mummy, he came back. I brought you something," James said, sitting carefully on the edge of her bed. He handed her the pin, watching as her eyes widened. "Is this from the real palace?" she asked, running her fingers over the golden surface. "It is. Every guard has one. Now you have one too." Sophie clutched the pin to her chest and looked up at James with an expression of such complete trust that it took his breath away. "Does this mean I'm like a guard now too?" "The bravest one I know," James replied, and meant it completely. Over the next hour, James sat with Sophie and her mother, listening to stories about Sophie's treatment, her dreams, and her incredible resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Sophie showed him a journal she kept, filled with drawings of castles, princesses, and unicorns. On one page, she had attempted to draw Buckingham Palace from memory, and James was surprised by how accurate her childish sketch actually was. "I want to be strong enough to visit someday," Sophie said, pointing to her drawing. "Do you think the Queen would like my picture?" James looked at the innocent artwork, created by a 6-year-old who was fighting for her life while maintaining hope for the future. In that moment, he made a promise that would change everything. "Sophie," he said, taking her small hand in his, "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you get to show that picture to someone very special. I can't promise it will be easy, and I can't promise it will happen quickly, but I promise I'll try." Sophie's smile could have powered the entire hospital. "Really? You'll really try?" "I will. But you have to promise me something in return. You have to keep being brave, and you have to keep fighting, okay? Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "I promise." "But James..." "Yes. What if I'm not brave enough? What if the fighting gets too hard?" James felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, something that hadn't happened since he was a child himself. "Then, you remember that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are scared. And if it gets too hard, you think about showing your picture to the Queen, and you remember that I believe in you." When visiting hours finally ended and James had to leave, Sophie made him promise to come back. As he walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, James realized that his life had just taken a turn that would either destroy his career or define it in ways he had never imagined. The next day, James began what would prove to be the most challenging mission of his military career. Armed with nothing but determination and Sophie's trust, he set out to navigate the Byzantine world of royal protocol in pursuit of what seemed like an impossible dream. His first stop was Sergeant Major Williams, his immediate superior. James had served under Williams for 6 years and respected him enormously, but he had never made a request quite like this one. "Sir," James began during their weekly briefing, "I need to discuss a special request." Williams looked up from his paperwork with the expression of a man who had heard every possible excuse and request in 25 years of military service. "Go ahead, Mitchell." James took a deep breath. "I met a young patient at the hospital yesterday during the royal visit. She's 6 years old, fighting cancer, and she has a dream of meeting the Queen or at least visiting the palace. I'd like to request permission to arrange something for her." Williams stared at him for a long moment. "You want to break protocol to fulfill a child's wish?" "Yes, sir." "Mitchell, you've been an exemplary guard for 12 years. Your record is spotless. Don't ruin it over something like this." "With respect, sir, I don't see this as ruining anything. I see it as fulfilling the highest purpose of our service." Williams leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. "The royal family schedule is planned months in advance. Security clearances take weeks to process. Even if I wanted to help you, which I'm not saying I do, this would require approvals far above my pay grade." James had expected this response, but he pressed on. "Sir, what if we started smaller? What if I could arrange for her to visit during a changing of the guard ceremony? Or perhaps a private tour of the parts of the palace that are open to the public?" "Mitchell, you're talking about making special accommodations for one child among thousands who would love such an opportunity. How do you justify that?" It was a fair question, and James had wrestled with it all night. "Because sometimes, sir, individual acts of kindness define who we really are. This little girl isn't asking for special treatment because she wants to be famous or because she feels entitled to it. She's asking because she's fighting for her life, and it gives her hope." Williams was quiet for several minutes, tapping his pen against his desk. Finally, he spoke. "I'll make some calls. I'm not promising anything, but I'll see what's possible. In the meantime, don't mention this to anyone else, and For God's sake, don't make any promises you can't keep. It was more than James had dared to hope for. As he left Williams's office, he felt a surge of optimism. Perhaps Sophie's dream wasn't impossible after all. Perhaps the rigid world of royal protocol had room for one small miracle. What James didn't know was that his request had set in motion a chain of conversations that would reach all the way to the highest levels of the royal household, and that Sophie's story was about to capture the attention of people with the power to make extraordinary things happen. 3 days passed with no word from Sergeant Major Williams, and James found himself checking his phone obsessively during every break in duty. Sophie's condition weighed heavily on his mind, especially after Sarah had texted him that Sophie was having a particularly difficult week with side effects from her intensified treatment regimen. James had exchanged phone numbers with Sophie's mother during his second visit, something that felt both natural and completely outside his normal boundaries as a royal guard. Sarah sent him daily updates about Sophie's condition, along with pictures that the little girl insisted on taking with her new Queen's Guard pin proudly displayed. One photograph particularly struck him. Sophie lay in her hospital bed, clearly exhausted from treatment, but holding up a drawing she had made of herself wearing a guard's uniform standing next to Buckingham Palace. At the bottom, in her careful 6-year-old handwriting, she had written Sophie the Brave Guard. On Thursday morning, as James prepared for the changing of the guard ceremony, Williams approached him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Mitchell, my office." After ceremony. The ceremony felt interminable. James stood at attention, performed the intricate drill movements with mechanical precision, and maintained the stoic expression required of his position. But, inside, his heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. Williams's tone had given nothing away about whether the news was good or bad. When the ceremony concluded and James reported to Williams's office, he found his superior sitting across from a woman he didn't recognize. She appeared to be in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything about him at once. "Mitchell, this is Lady Catherine Ashworth, Deputy Private Secretary to Her Majesty," Williams said. "She'd like to speak with you about your request." James felt his mouth go dry. The Deputy Private Secretary was one of the most powerful positions in the royal household, with direct access to the Queen herself. He had never imagined that his request would reach such high levels. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," Lady Ashworth said, her voice cultured but warm. "Please sit down. I understand you've made an unusual request regarding a young hospital patient." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Her name is Sophie Thompson, and she's 6 years old. Sergeant Major Williams has briefed me on the basic facts, but I'd like to hear directly from you why you feel this warrants the attention of the royal household." James took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on his answer. "Ma'am, in 12 years of service, I've protected members of the royal family during state visits, ceremonies, and public appearances. I've always understood my duty to be maintaining their safety and upholding the dignity of the crown. But meeting Sophie has made me realize that sometimes our highest service comes from recognizing what the crown truly represents." Lady Ashworth raised an eyebrow. "And what does it represent, in your opinion?" "Hope, ma'am. Continuity. The idea that there are things in this world worth preserving and protecting. Sophie is fighting the hardest battle imaginable, and her dream of meeting the Queen isn't about celebrity or entitlement. It's about connecting with something larger than herself, something that represents courage and perseverance. Staff Sergeant, you realize that if we made exceptions for every deserving child, we would be overwhelmed with requests. The royal family receives thousands of letters each year from people facing difficult circumstances. I understand that, ma'am. But this isn't about making a general policy change. This is about one specific situation where we have the power to make an enormous difference in a child's life, possibly in her final months." Lady Ashworth was quiet for a moment, studying James carefully. "You've visited her multiple times since your initial meeting, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am. 3 times. That's quite unusual for someone in your position." James nodded. "It is, ma'am. But so is meeting a 6-year-old who faces each day with more courage than most adults show in a lifetime." "Tell me about her." For the next 20 minutes, James found himself describing Sophie in detail. He told Lady Ashworth about the puzzle, about Sophie's drawings, about her matter-of-fact discussions of her illness, and about the way she had brightened when he gave her the guard pin. He described her mother's quiet strength and the way Sophie's hope seemed to inspire everyone around her. "She keeps a journal," James said, "filled with drawings of the palace and stories about what she imagines it would be like to meet the queen. She doesn't ask for much, just the chance to show her drawings to someone who might understand how much the royal family means to her. When he finished, Lady Ashworth was quiet for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, what you're asking for is unprecedented. Members of the public, particularly children, don't typically receive private audiences or special tours. However, she paused. There are occasionally circumstances that warrant exceptional consideration. James felt his heart racing. Ma'am, Her Majesty has always taken a special interest in the welfare of children, particularly those facing serious illness. While I cannot promise anything specific, I am willing to explore what might be possible within the bounds of security and protocol. What would that involve? First, we would need complete medical clearance from her doctors, confirming that she is well enough for a visit to the palace. Second, we would need thorough background checks on both Sophie and her mother. Third, the timing would have to work around the Queen's schedule, which is determined months in advance. James nodded eagerly. Whatever requirements you have, I'm sure Sophie's family would be willing to meet them. There's something else, Lady Ashworth continued. This would not be a public event. No media, no publicity. The royal household occasionally makes private gestures of this nature, but they are kept completely confidential. Can you assure me that Sophie's family understands and would respect this? Absolutely, ma'am. They're not seeking attention. They just want to give Sophie something to hope for. Lady Ashworth stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I'll be in touch with Sergeant Major Williams about next steps. In the meantime, please don't mention this conversation to Sophie or her family. I don't want to raise expectations for something that may not be possible. As James left Williams's office, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Sophie's dream had moved closer to reality, but it was still far from certain. The royal household was considering her request, but James knew that there were still dozens of obstacles that could prevent it from happening. That evening, James visited Sophie at the hospital. She had had a good day, relatively speaking, and was sitting up in bed working on a new drawing. This one showed the Queen surrounded by her guards, all of them protecting something precious in the center of the palace. What's in the middle? James asked, pointing to the elaborate structure Sophie had drawn in the center of her picture. Hope, Sophie said simply. Mummy told me that the palace protects hope for everyone in the country. Is that true? James looked at the drawing, created by a child who understood things that many adults missed entirely. Yes, he said. I think that's exactly true. James, do you think the Queen knows about kids like me? Kids who are sick? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Well, she lives in a big palace and meets important people all the time. Do you think she knows about regular kids who are just trying to get better? James thought about Lady Ashworth's words about the Queen's special interest in children facing illness. I think she knows, Sophie. I think she cares very much about kids like you. Good, Sophie said, settling back against her pillows. Because I have something I want to tell her if I ever meet her. What's that? I want to tell her that even when you're really sick, you can still be brave. And I want to thank her for having guards like you who help kids feel better. That night, James lay awake thinking about Sophie's words. She wanted to thank the Queen for having guards who help children. But James knew that helping Sophie wasn't part of his official duties. It was something he had chosen to do because it felt right, because it felt like the truest expression of what service really meant. The next week brought a series of phone calls and meetings that made James feel like he was navigating a maze of royal bureaucracy. Lady Ashworth's assistant contacted him with a list of requirements that needed to be met before any visit could be considered. The medical clearance proved to be the biggest hurdle. Sophie's oncologist, Dr. Patricia Winters, was initially hesitant to approve any activity that might stress Sophie's weakened immune system. It took 2 meetings and a detailed security briefing before she agreed to consider it. And even then, she insisted on conditions that would allow her to monitor Sophie's condition throughout any potential visit. The background checks were more straightforward, but equally thorough. Sarah Thompson had to provide detailed personal history, financial records, and references going back 10 years. The investigation was conducted so discreetly that Sarah later told James she had no idea it was happening. Meanwhile, Sophie's condition continued to fluctuate. She had good days when she seemed almost like a normal 6-year-old, chatting excitedly about her drawings and asking James endless questions about palace life. But she also had difficult days when the treatment left her too weak to sit up, when even holding a conversation was exhausting. On one particularly bad day, James arrived at the hospital to find Sophie sleeping, her breathing shallow and labored. Sarah sat beside her bed, holding her daughter's hand and crying quietly. The doctors say the cancer isn't responding as well as they hoped, Sarah whispered. They're talking about more aggressive treatments, but they're also being honest about the risks. James felt a chill run through him. What does that mean? It means we may be running out of time, Sarah said, her voice breaking. It means that if Sophie's dream is ever going to come true, it needs to happen soon. That evening, James did something he had never done in his career. He called Lady Ashworth directly, using the number she had provided for emergencies. Lady Ashworth, this is Staff Sergeant Mitchell. I'm calling about Sophie Thompson. Yes, Staff Sergeant. How can I help you? Her condition is deteriorating. The doctors are being more direct about her prognosis. If this is going to happen, it needs to be soon. There was a long pause. I see. Let me make some calls. Can you have the medical clearance expedited? I'll speak with Dr. Winters tomorrow morning. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to understand that what you're asking for would require Her Majesty to personally approve an exception to protocols that have been in place for decades. Even if I recommend it, there's no guarantee she'll agree. I understand, ma'am. But I have to ask. Give me 48 hours. I'll have an answer by Friday afternoon. As James hung up the phone, he realized that Friday afternoon would determine not just whether Sophie's dream would come true, but whether his own faith in the institution he served would be vindicated or shattered. In 48 hours, he would learn whether the royal household he had dedicated his life to protecting still had room for the kind of human compassion that Sophie represented. Friday morning arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to hang over Buckingham Palace like a held breath. James had barely slept the night before, checking his phone every few minutes for any word from Lady Ashworth. Sophie had been on his mind constantly, along with the weight of knowing that by the end of the day, her greatest dream would either move toward reality or be definitively crushed. During the morning ceremony, James found it nearly impossible to maintain his usual focus. The familiar routine of the changing of the guard felt surreal, as if he were performing his duties while floating somewhere outside his own body. His fellow guards noticed nothing amiss, but James felt as though every tourist watching the ceremony could see his anxiety written across his face. At 11:30, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Sophie asking for you. Rough night, but wants to show you new drawing. James's heart clenched. He was scheduled for duty until 3 o'clock, and Lady Ashworth had promised to contact him by afternoon. The timing couldn't have been worse, but he knew he needed to see Sophie, especially if the news from the royal household turned out to be disappointing. During his lunch break, James made a decision that could have resulted in disciplinary action. He called in a personal favor with Corporal Davies, a fellow guard who owed him for covering an emergency shift the previous month. Davies, I need you to cover the last 2 hours of my post. Personal emergency. Mitchell, you know we can't just swap duties without approval from Williams. I'll take full responsibility. If Williams has a problem, tell him to call me directly. There was a pause. This must be serious. You've never asked anything like this before. It is serious. More serious than I can explain right now. All right, but you owe me big time. James arrived at the hospital at 2:15, still wearing his red tunic, but having left his bearskin and ceremonial sword at the palace. He found Sophie propped up in bed, looking pale but alert, with a piece of paper in her hands. James, she exclaimed, her face lighting up despite her obvious fatigue. I made something for you. She held out the paper, revealing a drawing that took James's breath away. It showed two figures standing together outside Buckingham Palace, a tall man in a Red Guard uniform and a small girl wearing a dress and a crown. But what made the drawing extraordinary was the detail. Sophie had somehow captured not just the physical appearance of the palace, but something deeper. The two figures in her drawing were holding hands, and above them, she had drawn a banner that read, Friends Forever. Do you like it? Sophie asked anxiously. I wanted to draw us together at the palace, just in case. Just in case what? Sophie looked down at her hands. Mummy doesn't think I know, but I heard the doctors talking. They said the medicine might not be working good enough anymore. James felt his throat constrict. At 6 years old, Sophie was facing the reality of her mortality with more grace than most adults could muster. Sophie, the doctors are still trying different treatments. There's still hope. I know, she said simply. But, just in case there isn't enough time, I wanted to make sure you knew that meeting you was the best thing that happened to me in the hospital. Even better than if I got to meet the Queen. The casual way she mentioned the Queen made James's phone call from Lady Ashworth even more crucial. At that moment, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Lady Ashworth's number. Sophie, I need to take this call. It's very important. I'll be right back, okay? James stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding as he answered the phone. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, this is Lady Ashworth. Yes, ma'am. I have news regarding Sophie Thompson's request. James held his breath. After extensive consultation with security personnel, medical staff, and Her Majesty herself, we have decided to approve a private visit to Buckingham Palace. James felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Ma'am, that's wonderful news. However, there are very specific conditions. The visit must take place this coming Monday afternoon, as it's the only window in Her Majesty's schedule for the foreseeable future. Dr. Winters must accompany Sophie and provide medical support throughout the visit. The entire event must remain completely confidential, with no media presence whatsoever. Of course, ma'am. Whatever conditions you require. There's something else, Staff Sergeant Mitchell. Her Majesty specifically requested that you be present for the visit, as Sophie's primary contact with the royal household. James was stunned. Her Majesty requested that I be there? She was quite impressed by your initiative and dedication. She feels that your presence would help Sophie feel more comfortable during what could be an overwhelming experience. I'm honored, ma'am. More honored than I can express. The visit will take place Monday at 2 o'clock. Sophie and her mother should arrive at the King's Gate, where you'll escort them to a private drawing room. Her Majesty will spend approximately 30 minutes with Sophie, after which you'll provide a brief tour of the staterooms that are accessible given Sophie's mobility limitations. James could hardly believe what he was hearing. Not only had the Queen agreed to meet Sophie, but she had personally requested his presence and arranged for a private tour. It was more than he had dared to hope for. Ma'am, how should I inform Sophie and her family? That's entirely up to you, Staff Sergeant Mitchell. This was your initiative from the beginning. You should be the one to tell them. After hanging up, James stood in the hospital corridor for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. In less than 4 days, Sophie would meet the Queen of England. Her impossible dream was about to come true. When he returned to Sophie's room, she was lying back against her pillows, looking exhausted from their brief conversation. Sarah sat beside her, reading quietly. Sophie, James said gently, sitting down beside her bed. I have something to tell you. She opened her eyes, focusing on him with effort. What is it? Do you remember what you told me about wanting to meet the Queen and show her your drawings? Sophie nodded slowly. Well, I've been talking to some very important people at the palace, and they've been talking to the Queen herself. Sophie's eyes widened, and she struggled to sit up straighter. Sarah looked up from her book, sensing the importance of the moment. And the Queen would very much like to meet you, Sophie. This coming Monday, you're invited to visit Buckingham Palace for a private meeting with Her Majesty. The room fell completely silent. Sophie stared at James with an expression of such pure disbelief and joy that it was almost painful to witness. Sarah dropped her book entirely, covering her mouth with her hands. Really? Sophie whispered. Really and truly? Really and truly. You'll get to meet the Queen, show her your drawings, and take a tour of the palace. And I'll be there with you the whole time. Sophie began to cry, but they were tears of overwhelming happiness rather than sadness. I can't believe it, she sobbed. I can't believe it's real. Sarah was crying too, reaching over to embrace her daughter. Oh, sweetheart, your dream is coming true. Can I bring all my drawings? Sophie asked through her tears. Can I wear my best dress? Will the Queen really want to see my pictures? You can bring whatever you want, James assured her. And I know for certain that the Queen will love seeing your artwork. Over the next hour, Sophie's room filled with excited planning. Sarah called Dr. Winters to discuss the medical logistics of the trip. Sophie insisted on going through her collection of drawings to choose the best ones to bring. The news seemed to energize her in a way that no medical treatment had managed to accomplish. James, Sophie said as visiting hours were coming to an end, do you think the Queen will like me? Sophie, I think the Queen is going to think you're one of the most remarkable people she's ever met. Will you help me practice what to say? I don't want to say the wrong thing. James smiled, thinking of all the formal training he had received in royal protocol over the years. I think the most important thing is just to be yourself. The Queen is going to love meeting the brave, kind, creative girl that I know. That weekend, James found himself in the unusual position of coaching a 6-year-old cancer patient in royal etiquette. He visited Sophie both Saturday and Sunday, helping her practice her curtsy, which she insisted on attempting despite her weakness, discussing what she might say to the Queen, and helping her organize the drawings she wanted to share. Sophie had decided to give the Queen the drawing she had made of the two of them standing together outside the palace. Because I want her to know that her guards are good at making friends, she explained. On Sunday evening, as James was preparing to leave the hospital, Sophie grabbed his hand. James, what if I'm too sick tomorrow? What if I can't do it? It was a question that had been haunting James as well. Sophie's condition was unpredictable, and there was no guarantee that Monday would be a good day for her. Then, we'll reschedule, James said firmly. The Queen will wait for you to be ready. But, even as he said it, James knew that rescheduling might not be possible. Sophie's window of strength was closing, and Monday might represent their only opportunity. Sophie, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've shown more courage in the past few weeks than most people show in a lifetime. Sophie smiled sleepily. Will you stay my friend even after I meet the Queen? Sophie, I'll be your friend forever. That's a promise. As James left the hospital that night, he offered a prayer to whatever powers might be listening that Monday would bring Sophie the strength she needed to meet her Queen. In less than 18 hours, the most important day of a little girl's life would begin, and James Mitchell would help make the impossible happen. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Great Ormond Street Hospital. James arrived at 7 o'clock, 3 hours earlier than necessary, unable to contain his nervous energy. He found Sarah in Sophie's room, carefully helping her daughter into a beautiful blue dress that matched her eyes. Sophie looked fragile but determined, her pale face brightened by excitement that seemed to give her strength. She had insisted on wearing the Queen's Guard pin that James had given her, which now gleamed proudly on her dress collar. Her collection of drawings was neatly organized in a special folder that Sarah had decorated with golden ribbons. How are you feeling, sweetheart? James asked, kneeling beside Sophie's wheelchair. Nervous, Sophie admitted, but the good kind of nervous. Like Christmas morning nervous. Dr. Winters arrived at noon to conduct a final medical assessment. Sophie's vital signs were stable, though she remained weak from her recent treatments. The doctor had prepared a portable medical kit and would accompany them to the palace as a precautionary measure. Sophie's determined to make this happen, Dr. Winters told James quietly. I've seen children rally their strength for important moments before. Sometimes hope is the most powerful medicine we have. The journey to Buckingham Palace took place in a specially arranged private car, with Sophie wrapped in blankets and clutching her folder of drawings. As they approached the famous gates, Sophie pressed her face to the window, her eyes wide with wonder. It's so much bigger than in my drawings, she whispered. James had arranged to meet them at the King's Gate, away from the crowds that typically gathered at the main entrance. When the car pulled up, he was waiting in his full ceremonial uniform, including the bearskin hat that Sophie had been so fascinated by during their first meeting. You look like a real prince, Sophie said as James helped her from the car to her wheelchair. And you look like a real princess, he replied, adjusting the blankets around her legs. The entrance to the palace through the King's Gate was an experience that clearly overwhelmed Sophie. The sheer scale of the corridors, the magnificent artwork covering every wall, and the hushed atmosphere of centuries of history left her speechless for several minutes. As they made their way through the palace corridors, James pointed out various paintings and artifacts, sharing stories he had learned during his years of service. Sophie listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed her remarkable intelligence and curiosity. Is it true that kings and queens from hundreds of years ago walked in these same hallways? She asked as they approached the drawing room where the meeting would take place. It is true, James replied. And now you're walking here too, which makes you part of that history. The drawing room was an elegant space decorated in cream and gold, with tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Lady Ashworth was waiting for them, along with a photographer who would document the private meeting for Sophie's family. Sophie, Lady Ashworth said warmly, Her Majesty is very much looking forward to meeting you. She's particularly interested in seeing the drawings that Staff Sergeant Mitchell has told her about. Sophie nodded seriously, clutching her folder more tightly. I brought my best ones. And I drew a special picture just for her. At exactly 2 o'clock, a door at the far end of the drawing room opened, and Queen Elizabeth entered. She was dressed in a powder blue suit with a simple but elegant brooch, and her presence filled the room with a dignity that was both regal and surprisingly warm. Sophie's reaction was immediate and perfect. Despite her weakness, she managed to stand from her wheelchair and perform the curtsy that James had helped her practice, though she wobbled slightly from the effort. Your Majesty, Sophie said in her clear, young voice, thank you for letting me visit your palace. The Queen approached Sophie with a smile that James had rarely seen during official engagements. It was the smile of a grandmother meeting a special child, not the formal expression of a monarch performing a duty. "Sophie, it's my pleasure to meet you," the Queen said, her voice gentle. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell has told me wonderful things about you, and I understand you have some artwork to share with me." For the next 30 minutes, James watched something magical unfold. Sophie showed the Queen each of her drawings, explaining her artistic choices with the seriousness of a professional artist presenting to a patron. The Queen examined each picture carefully, asking thoughtful questions about Sophie's techniques and inspiration. The drawing of Buckingham Palace from Sophie's memory particularly impressed the Queen. "You've captured details that many visitors miss entirely," she observed. "How did you remember so much from photographs?" "I studied them really hard," Sophie explained, "because I wanted to get it right for when I met you." When Sophie presented the special drawing she had created of herself and James standing together outside the palace, the Queen's expression grew even softer. "This is beautiful, Sophie. I can see that you and Staff Sergeant Mitchell have become good friends." "He's the best friend I've made in the hospital," Sophie said proudly. "He helped me believe that dreams could come true." The Queen turned to look at James, who had been standing at attention throughout the meeting. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, would you join us, please?" James approached, somewhat surprised to be included in what was meant to be Sophie's moment. "Sophie," the Queen continued, "I want you to know that your drawing has reminded me of something very important. The guards who protect this palace aren't just soldiers. They're people with kind hearts who understand that true service sometimes means going beyond what's expected of them." She paused, looking directly at James. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell has exemplified the very best of what it means to serve others. By helping you, he has honored both his uniform and his humanity." Sophie beamed with pride, as if she had personally trained James to be such an exceptional guard. "Your Majesty," Sophie said suddenly, "I have something I want to tell you." "What's that, dear?" "I want to thank you for having guards like James. Even when I was really sick and scared, he made me feel brave. He told me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are scared." The Queen glanced at James again, a look of approval in her eyes. "That's very wise advice. And you, Sophie, are one of the bravest people I've ever had the honor to meet." After the formal meeting concluded, James was given the extraordinary privilege of providing Sophie with a private tour of selected staterooms. Though she was clearly tiring, Sophie's excitement never diminished. She marveled at the throne room, asked detailed questions about the ballroom, and insisted on having her photograph taken in front of the grand staircase. "James," she whispered as they concluded the tour, "this is the best day of my whole life. Even if I never have another good day, this one was perfect." The comment hit James like a physical blow, reminding him of the cruel reality that overshadowed this magical afternoon. Sophie's time was limited, and this visit might represent the peak of joy in her short life. As they prepared to leave, the Queen made one final appearance to say goodbye. She presented Sophie with a signed photograph and a small gift, a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the words, "For Sophie, with admiration and affection, Elizabeth R." "Sophie," the Queen said, taking the little girl's hands, "I want you to remember that you have brought great joy to my day. Your courage, your kindness, and your beautiful spirit are gifts that you've shared not just with me, but with everyone you meet." Sophie hugged the Queen with the unself-conscious affection of a child, and, for a moment, the formal protocols of royal interaction disappeared entirely. They were simply two people, one young and one elderly, sharing a moment of pure human connection. The journey back to the hospital was quiet, with Sophie exhausted but radiating contentment. She clutched her signed photograph and wore her new bracelet with obvious pride. "James," she said as they pulled up to the hospital, "when I get back to my room, I'm going to start a new drawing. It's going to show me and the Queen having tea together. Do you think she would like that?" "I think she would love it, Sophie." Over the following weeks, Sophie's condition continued to deteriorate, but she never lost the joy that her palace visit had given her. She told her story to every nurse, doctor, and visitor who would listen, always emphasizing James's role in making her dream come true. She completed her drawing of having tea with the Queen, and James arranged for it to be delivered to the palace. A few days later, a handwritten note arrived from the Queen herself, thanking Sophie for the artwork and telling her that it would have a place of honor in her private study. Sophie's battle with cancer continued for another 6 weeks. During that time, James visited her almost every day, watching as she grew weaker but never less spirited. Her room became a shrine to her palace visit, with photographs and mementos displayed proudly on every available surface. On a quiet Thursday morning in May, Sophie passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family and holding the Queen's Guard pin that had started their friendship. At Sophie's funeral, James was asked to serve as an honorary pallbearer, a role that felt like the most important duty of his career. The church was filled with people whose lives Sophie had touched during her brief time on Earth, and story after story was shared about her courage, kindness, and infectious optimism. The Queen sent a personal wreath with a note that read simply, "For Sophie, who showed us all what true nobility looks like. With deepest sympathy and enduring gratitude." After the service, Sarah approached James with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did for Sophie. You gave her the greatest gift imaginable." "She gave me a greater gift," James replied. "She taught me what service really means." 6 months later, James received an unexpected summons to meet with Lady Ashworth. When he arrived at her office, he found her reviewing a thick file of documents. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," she said, "your actions regarding Sophie Thompson have come to the attention of some very senior people in the royal household. Your initiative, compassion, and dedication have been noted as exemplary examples of what it means to serve the crown." She paused, studying his expression. "We would like to offer you a new position. You would become part of a special unit that handles requests from seriously ill children and their families. It would involve working closely with various charities and occasionally facilitating meetings like the one you arranged for Sophie." James was stunned. "Ma'am, that would be an incredible honor. The position was created specifically because of what you accomplished with Sophie. Her story has inspired a new approach to royal engagement with children facing serious illness." As James left the meeting, he thought about Sophie's drawing that now hung in the Queen's private study. A little girl's dream of meeting the Queen had not only come true, but had created lasting change in how the royal household approached such requests. Sophie Thompson had lived for only 6 years, but her courage, hope, and infectious joy had touched the highest levels of British society. Through her friendship with a royal guard who chose compassion over protocol, she had proven that sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference. James Mitchell continued to serve as a Queen's Guard for many more years, but he never forgot the lesson that Sophie had taught him. That true honor comes not from following rules, but from knowing when breaking them serves a higher purpose. In helping Sophie achieve her impossible dream, he had discovered his own.